discovers itself as its otherness to itself. The one is illuminated by a light distinct from lux, that light associated with the Enlightenment, which shone on everything indiscriminately and gave it a rational clarity, a public transparency. This is simply a light passively experienced. The light of the illuminationist is lumen, a light associated with the active sensibility of individual subjects. This is to say, the one is encountered only by individuals, one by one, who experience as a part of themselves. I want to make two different kinds of points regarding this part of the argument. First, I will direct you to Laclau's productive return in Unpopulist Reason to Freud's group psychology, where Laclau rightly highlights the fact that Freud defended his entry into the field of group psychology on the grounds that he had never conceived the individual subject apart from his relations with others, parents, siblings, physicians, helpers, opponents. I would insist that Freud went further. He argued that the distinction between the individual and the group fell within the individual. This is to say, there would never be any possibility of a group's forming, never be any relations with others at all, were it not for the fact that individual subjects are invaded or seized by an extra individual reality, by the one or the non-abstract universal, by a reality that the subject cannot lay personal claim to or call her own. While, as was said, the individual emerges from this apophatic reality by absolving it of its indefiniteness, by realizing it in and as some form, no form can ever be the form of the one. It is this impossibility of anyone's being able to exhaust the one, to isolate herself in an unbroken or total form, which opens the possibility of both cooperative and conflicted relations with others. Long before group psychology, as early as 1895, the year he published the project, Freud had maintained that the individual subject is always partnered with another, a fellow human being, which cannot be cognized as a content. From the beginning, then, Freud conceived the subject as bound to a surplus that entered her into an anonymous fellowship that she would spend her life trying to define alongside others. If I am not mistaken, the authors of Hegemony and Socialist Strategy make one misstep when they define a specific social configuration as defining itself against a constitutive outside, described as that which the configuration is not. We need to understand a society and an individual as that which defines itself against that which it is never not, the one that seizes it without ever becoming a predicate of it. I mentioned earlier that the theosophical concepts of the Shiite mystics still inform contemporary political theory, even though their interpretations are at times manifestly tendentious. The concept of fana, or ivana, like the words flammable and inflammable, they mean the same thing, is a significant example. A complex concept, it is subject to much interpretive debate. Some argue that there are different forms of fana, but what is clear is that the contemporary phenomenon of suicide bombing sanctions itself through a specific and narrow reading of the concept of this concept, and understands it as a requirement to merge oneself with the ineffable or hidden God, with the one. A more careful reading would reveal, however, that fana could not require a merger or fusion with the one for the reasons given above. The one is not that into which individuals are absorbed, but that out of which they emerge. The encounter with the one that inhabits and seizes us is not an invitation to immolate oneself on the altar of an absolute otherness, but to become, to give form to what one will have discovered oneself to have been. For this reason, it is possible to claim that the concept of fauna reappears in the Lacanian concept of aphanaisis, that flickering in eclipse whereby the subject oscillates between her disappearance and her appearance. For Lacan, too, the point is not that the subject is permanently annihilated, but that she emerges, comes into existence in a modal manner out of an extra-individual hiddenness. I want to end with this illustration of the way concepts of Shiite mysticism continue to have an existence as if in a trans-historical curve in contemporary thought, including and in a powerful way in the work of Laclau and Mouffe, where it operates to theorize democracy and to help us to safeguard its survival.
I was worried that some people on the left couldn't see me. I want to thank Jacques for giving me this opportunity to honor this extraordinary book and to have a chance to engage with it. My title for my remarks today is a quote from one of my favorite plays, which is, "I may be dead, I may not know who I am, but I'll always be a socialist." As you can imagine, given the quote and my own past as an activist in Marxist movements, I was thrilled when Laclau and Mouffe's book came out because it had the word socialism in the title. 25 years later, we are still, and by we, I mean radicals on the left, are profoundly in their debt for their searing critique of the economism of the European Marxist parties, and more specifically, for their fundamental insight that the struggles for socialism is always a political struggle and not one that is in any way determined by a pre-given set of forces of history. Some of their insights, for example, into how subordination must be politically activated so that it becomes a site of oppression to be resisted and a form of domination to be changed, remain as enlightening to us today as they were then. Certainly, their critique of the left for turning over questions of so-called culture to the right because they were an aside to class politics still deliver a powerful warning of why the left must not limit itself to certain forms of outdated class struggles. Our project today, however, is to focus on the relevance of hegemony and socialist strategy to a radical political project. I want to begin with two quotes and with what I see as an important corrective to many readings of Laclau and Mouffe's text. That corrective is that I do not read hegemony and socialist strategy as only a defense of radical and plural democracy, although it is that, but more importantly also as a deepening of the understanding of socialist practice. Here are the two quotes. Of course, every project for radical democracy implies a socialist dimension, as it's necessary to put an end to capitalist relations of production, which are at the root of numerous relations of subordination. But socialism is one of the components of a project of radical democracy, not vice versa. That's 178. And this is the second quote, if the subversive moment of the logic of democracy and the positive moment of the institution of the social are no longer unified by any anthropological foundation which transforms them into fronts and reverse sides of a signal process, it follows clearly that every possible form of unity between the two is contingent and is therefore the result of a process of articulation. This being the case, no hegemonic project can be based exclusively on democratic logic, but also must consist of a set of proposals for the positive organization of the social, 188, 189. All of my four major questions today will be seeking clarification from Laclau and Mouffe about the significance of a socialist project, including projects of global transformation. My questions will be based on South African struggles to bring our theoretical discussion down to the ongoing battles in the name of a socialist project that predominate the political landscape and discursive field of the new South Africa. Let me begin with Laclau's argument of how a particular section of society comes to be identified with the general emancipation of society as a whole. In his dialogue with Judith Butler and Slavoj Žižek, Laclau argues that a particular sector of society comes to represent, if of course only imperfectly, the universal because it names its own oppression as a result of a general crime. Laclau here is elaborating the first dimension of a hegemonic relation, which is unevenness of power. But my question to him and to Chantal Mouffe is this: is it the meaning of a general crime that allows a particular sector's oppression to represent the universal, or is it instead the representation of universal ideals that would overcome the conditions of oppression that allows a sector of society to stand in for the promised universal of the quote-unquote impossible, free and equal societies? Famously, the African National Congress did not generalize racist oppression by condemning apartheid as the Antichrist. Instead, in 1956, the ANC did indeed establish itself as the leader of the oppressed. And note that this is before the establishment of apartheid and the exile and imprisonment of all the ANC leaders, through the elaboration of a freedom charter, which, to use Laclau and Mouffe's own phrasing, sought to articulate, quote-unquote, management of the positivity of the social and the articulation of diverse democratic demands so as to achieve again, in Laclau and Mouffe's phrasing, maximum integration. Famously, the Freedom Charter did indeed call for nationalization and socialization of the means of production and all basic resources, and therefore profoundly challenged the right to private property as basic to freedom. My second question is related to the first. Laclau and Mouffe never denied that we need a vision of what kind of society we are fighting for. But it's never enough for them to simply name a frontier and call out an adversity. Although, as we know, both of these aspects are crucial to what they defend as agnostic and pluralistic democracy. Throughout, they argue that the great democratic revolutions provide us with those ideals which extend our passion for liberty, which is why they have completely rejected the Jacobin moment in Marxist heritage and have argued that we must deepen liberal democracy and not overthrow it. The problem in the Anglo-American context is that liberal democracy and all notions of liberal freedom, not just the neoliberal, accept that freedom is inextricably associated with the right to private property, now even more broadly construed. Certainly neoliberals have extended that right to patent and copyright, to areas of nature and genetic manufacturing that were once seen as simply beyond property because they were either natural or part of the shared knowledge of humanity. So neoliberals have undoubtedly extended property rights beyond what was once conceived as their proper reach. That said, left-leaning liberals, including John Rawls, never challenged the right to private property in any way, but simply regulated in the name of redistribution. But at least in the Anglo-American context, a certain socialist project is legally foreclosed. And so it would seem that we would not only need a deepening, but a reconceptualization of democracy for a socialist project, at least in the Anglo-American context. At the very least, do we not need to set up a profound tension between the right to private property and other socioeconomic rights, which of course we don't have, such as the right to housing, education, etc. Of course, in the United States, we do not have constitutionally protected socioeconomic rights, and this is in part because the protection of private property is foundational, and because of the negative vertical nature of the Constitution does not impose social obligations on the state, which is why the debate on affirmative action is unique to the United States. You have a Constitution that imposes social obligations on the state, then the state has constitutional affirmative duties, and that's taken for granted. It's simply not taken for granted in the United States, obviously, since we did an affirmative action in its limited context. This tension, however, is embodied in the South African Constitution in sections 25 and 26 of the Bill of Rights, one that protects the right to housing, the other that protects the right to private property. This tension has indeed been productive in the creation of what Sheila Ben-Aviv and Robert Cubber have called juris-generative transformations of the right to private property. In the words of Justice Albie Sachs, an emeritus justice of the South African Constitutional Court, the question of the ownership of land is only the beginning and not the end of an investigation about whether or not shanty dwellers should be evicted from the land they illegally occupy under private law. A subsidiary question then to Laclau and Mouffe is how far will we have to move in any given society, or indeed global social ordering, to a notion of social rights, and therefore some kind of socialist project in order to allow the space for the challenge of the foundations of the right to private property. And Chantal, this is a particular question to you because you have written more than Ernesto has on the question of the relationship of right to law and the role of law and right in transforming change. My next question involves a view of the ethical which has been defended by both thinkers, but has been explicitly defended again by Laclau in his exchange with Butler and Fouchard. Let me just stress, to a certain extent, I agree with him that there is an unstable relationship between the ethical and the normative, but disagree with or want to put into question the idea that the ethical is a moment of madness, or it cannot even briefly represent the desire for the impossible, unreachable fullness of society, which, and again I agree, no social order can ever hope to fully achieve. To draw out my question, I want to use the example of the Ubuntu electricians in South Africa, a group which the Ubuntu Project, of which I'm the co-director, has not only interviewed in terms of their own ethical and political understanding of their undertaking, but also supported. Famously, and we've supported them by joining with several other groups to attack the parliamentary criminalization of the Ubuntu electricians. Famously, the Ubuntu electricians reinstall electricity in homes and shacks where it has been turned off before people can pay their bills. They do this relentlessly to the point that the ANC has moved to prepaid meters in order to counter the effectiveness of their action, and as I wrote, have passed a special bill to criminalize. The Ubuntu electricians' response is to smash up these prepaid meters and to call on others to join with the struggle. And how do they articulate their struggle? Their struggle is against capitalism, for socialism, in the name of Ubuntu. It is, of course, beyond my comments today to offer anything like an adequate articulation of Ubuntu. The closest we get to it in the English language is that it's an activist ethic of virtue in which what it means to be a human being is ethically performed on a day-to-day basis in a context in which how we are supposed to live together is constantly evoked and at the same time called into question. It has a lot of resonance, Sheila, with what you called a democratic practice. It is reducible, with a strong ethical edge, it is reducible to our own liberalism communitarian debate because Ubuntu carries with it a strong commitment to individuation and the realization of each person's capabilities, even if understood as it must be understood as a social project. Now, in some ways, the Ubuntu electricians seem to exemplify Laclau and Mouffe's socialist activists, since they're not fighting for any pre-given interest, and most of them count themselves among the lucky ones who are employed in the new South Africa. Conservative economists say that unemployment's about 37%, the more radical economists say 50%, and that is counting anyone who has any paid employment during the course of the year. Instead, they see themselves as a moment, using Laclau and Mouffe's vocabulary deliberately, in a discursive field and set of movements explicitly fighting for socialism. My question here, then, to return to the ethical as a moment of madness, is whether the movements like that of the Ubuntu electricians might not better be understood through Hart and Negri's conceptualization of a dialogue between lost intellectual heritage and habits, which articulate an ethical practice which does indeed have content, if not that of prescribed rules and practice. Another way of putting this, to use Sheila Ben-Abib's formulation, is that Ubuntu, as an ethical practice, itself undergoes a democratic iteration as it becomes part not only of an explicit struggle against the privatization of electricity, but also the socialist praxis, which right now tries to keep a resource like electricity in the commons or as a common good. The Ubuntu electricians are so effective that on the drive from Cape Town Airport into Cape Town, you'll see sign after sign reminding the population that it's a crime to turn on electricity when someone has been unable to pay their bills, and that we will all be obligated to turn in the Ubuntu electricians if we find them engaged in such work. Their response is that we're all obligated to fight against the privatization of electricity and indeed join them in smashing of prepaid meters if we happen to run across one. So my question to Laclau and Mouffe, and they write this on the signs, do other ethical practices, indeed non-European practices, signal a different relationship between the ethical and the political? If they do not undermine antagonism understood as a limit to any fullness of civilization, might they not undermine the necessity of the friend-enemy opposition as a form of that antagonism in all circumstances? I'm going to move on for the sake of time. My last question, also turning to an on-the-ground movement, is South Africa, is the shanty dwellers, is twofold. Is there a logic of capitalism which is more than a given conjecture in a specific setting, in Laclau and Mouffe's terms, that is an effective limit on hegemonic projects and therefore must be overcome? Do we need something like the topography and topology of capitalism, such as developed by Hart and